Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to talk about the books that I read in the month of September. To start off with, I have to talk about a book that I finished my August wrap-up with and said that I had finished it or was going to finish it, but I didn't actually finish it until September 3rd. And that book is Russia, A Thousand-Year Chronicle of the Wild East. I mentioned in August wrap-up that I was a little unsure of how much detail Sixsmith would actually pay to all of this 1,000-year history, because at that point I had gotten to page 150 out of 530, and we were already in the 1800s. Well, I went back to the book and realized, no, we were in the mid 1800s at page 150. And by page 200, we got to the 1917 revolution. This book was published in 2011, so Sixsmith spent more than half of a book claiming to be a 1,000-year chronicle, talking about less than 100 years of Russia's history. I was really disappointed in this book because I have read a lot about the Soviet era, about the Romanovs, about Catherine the Great, and I wanted to know more, even more about Russia, especially the early Romanov period and before that. The only things he talks about in the early parts of the book are things that he wants to make connections to later in the Soviet era. The next book I read this month is another holdover from August. I hadn't gotten to it yet, and it's The Secret Daughter. The setup is that there's two families. One woman in India, Gowda, she can't keep her baby because boys are valued and girls are not. The other woman, Summer, in San Francisco, is a doctor and realizes she can't have kids. Gowda gives away her baby, who ends up being the baby that Summer and her husband adopt. Her husband is also Indian, and Gowda is from India. I thought, oh, it's gonna be a feel-good story, nothing too deep, nothing, I don't know. Just feel good. I thought that I would list some of the cliches that this book had, but then I kept reading and went, oh no, that will be way too long. This book is a walking cliche. Easy to read, but I didn't really identify with any of the characters. The third book I read in September is The Lady of the Rivers. Now, going into it, I wasn't sure quite what I would get. I have a hesitation when it comes to popular books or popular authors like Philippa Gregory. I wonder how much hype there is. I wonder if it's been built up just by people who, I don't know, it's hard to explain what I think about like hype and things like that, but a lot of times really popular books aren't necessarily good. They just have a lot of marketing behind them. And sometimes that happens for authors. But in this case, I really enjoyed this book. I loved the fact that the hype wasn't overblown. I have studied English history. I know a lot about the Tudor time period, and I've read a lot about that, but not as much during the Cousins' War, the War of the Roses. And let me just say, what I have studied, it gets really confusing. And it could be confusing in this book, but Gregory does a really good job explaining things and making you really invest in Gowda. And she does a really good job at taking decades of this woman's history, a history that's not really talked about, because in that time period, women didn't get a lot of the pages. You know, they didn't get a lot of mentions in the history books. Lady Rivers played a huge, significant part. I also loved being able to stop and look up. I would Google things, and while Gregory did take some artistic liberties, because this is a work of fiction, her historiography is solid, and I love that. The fourth book I read this month of September is a short one, The Kite Fighters by Linda Sue Park. Now, when I picked it up and noticed how short it was, I wasn't sure, because I tend to struggle a little bit with children's literature. It's not really for me. I mean, it's children's literature, but it's not really something that I enjoy digging into and trying to review. This book, however, I absolutely adored. Sue Park did a really, really good job establishing all of these characters in a short time. It deals with an aspect of Asian history that's not talked about a lot. The Koreans. It was during the time of the Korean Empire. It deals with two brothers. The main character is the younger brother. He has other siblings and things, but he's a little bit resentful that his older brother like gets all of the privileges and things that are passed on to the older brother. But he's still really good friends with his brother. He just gets frustrated. He loves to fly kites, and they end up being able to work together to build a kite, and then the king gets involved, and it's a child king, so about their same age. It's so beautifully, whimsically written and believable. There's character growth, even in a short book. Park writes in a way that is digestible for middle grades without talking down to them. So she has the appropriate syntax and vocabulary, but still a really good, solid story, and that's what makes for good literature. Okay, so for the next reviews, my voice apparently is a little scratchy this morning, so just pardon that. The next book I read was one of the buddy reads for Murphy's Patreon. Now, I will admit that I haven't had time to participate in any of the discussions about it, but I'm really glad that I read it, and I wouldn't have if I hadn't been a part of it, at least to choose to vote and to pick up the book. And that book is The Jasmine Throne. I did not know what to expect. It's been a long time since I have picked up a work of fantasy for some reason other than it was part of the SCASL list. This book I had heard talked about on BookTube a lot. I'd heard it talked about as if it was really good, and so that both lent me towards reading it. I was interested based on the synopsis, and also a little wary because I didn't know if the hype would live up. Thankfully, it did. I rated this book 4.5 stars, and I'll talk briefly about why and not 5 stars. But from the beginning, when I first started reading it, it was just a few minutes before bed, and I'm like, wow, this is intense. I want to slow down and savor every morsel of this. And I'm like, it's a big book, and I also have lots of other books that I want to read this month. So it did take me a little longer because I was going slower than I normally do because it was so amazing. I love how Suri built up the world, how she gradually explained the magic. I'm not a huge fan of info dumps. I do understand that sometimes they have to happen, but here Suri avoids the info dump, but also doesn't keep the reader in the dark more than the characters. We find out things about the magic and the world building as the characters do, or at least as they learn how the pieces fit together, which is brilliant. The reason I gave this 4.5 stars is because of the romance. I felt like this romance was completely unnecessary. Also, I didn't believe it. Malini, the princess, just seemed rather unlikable. Like you feel for her with the situation that she's put in, but at many other times she's very manipulative, and I love Priya so much, the other character. I love her so much, and she's such a strong character. I'm like, why do you have a thing for Malini? Doesn't make sense. So that is the only reason that I gave this 4.5 stars and not 5. Next we have Anne Frank, Beyond the Diary, a Photographic Remembrance. When I saw the length, which is not much, I was a little bit worried, but I wanted to still give it a chance, and I'm glad that I did. This book, written in the 90s, it adds something to a story that so many of us think that we know so well, but with the addition of those photographs from the time before the Frank family went into hiding, it adds depth to a story that you didn't think that it could go that much more deeper. These people become so real, especially Margot and Anne, because so many of the pictures are of them. It's brilliant. I absolutely loved it. The only thing that I didn't like was some of the text formatting around the pictures. It was a choice by the publishers, and it's not that I didn't like the text itself. I loved the text that went along with the photographs, but the formatting that they used was a little bit distracting, and so that's why I rated this book 4 instead of 5 stars. Next we have Keeping Score by Linda Sue Park. Now the first book of hers that I read this month, absolutely loved. When I started reading this book, I noticed that I didn't necessarily connect with the characters as much even though I love baseball and I loved Maggie's character, just something felt not as authentic about Park's writing in this as the other books. Still a good book, although the friendship that she develops with one of the firemen at her father's old house, but she still goes back and visit this firehouse. And this new fireman, Jim, she strikes up a friendship with him, and it just felt odd to have a full-grown man and a young girl develop a friendship. Nothing about Park's writing made it seem icky. I just was thinking about what it actually means, even though Maggie, the narrator, obviously she wasn't. And how Park uses that friendship, it becomes more obvious as the book goes on. But I'll say that made me a little bit uncomfortable, and I didn't connect with this book as much. The next book, on the other hand, also by Park, When My Name Was Keoko. This one I loved. I absolutely loved, and I learned so much from it. The two primary characters, Sunhee and Taeyul, they are brother and sister. The narrative goes back and forth between them, and they're both Korean, living in Korea during the height of the Japanese occupation and World War II. There's a lot. I knew that there was a lot that the Japanese did to the Koreans during their occupation, and there's not a lot of fond memories from Koreans, especially who lived through that generation and perhaps their children, because of what the Japanese did. The whole premise of the title, When My Name Was Keoko, at a certain point, I think it was a year or so before the war started, the Japanese government said, hey, you have to take Japanese names now. Period. The end. You have to take Japanese names. And they would get in serious trouble if they referred to each other by their Korean names. And names are so important to identity. So important. This government, this foreign occupying government is coming in and saying, you can no longer have your name. You can no longer have that thing that identifies you with your culture. You have to identify with our culture. And they took away so many things. They took away the writing. They took away all sorts of things. And to see this play out through the eyes of a middle schooler into high school, Sunhee primarily, was so eye-opening. I learned so much about what happened during the Japanese occupation of Korea. And Park does such a good job with building up these characters and really getting you to imagine what their life was like. So based on what I know, Park, stick to writing Korean characters.
So the next book I have that I read in the month of September just might be my favorite book of the entire year. Yeah, I loved it that much, and that is Raybearer. I read this in 2 days, 2 weekdays, which is remarkable for me because I don't have a lot of extra reading time on school days. Full disclosure, I did stay up late the second night. I don't know how late because I decided I'm not gonna look at my watch and get all concerned about how late I'm staying up because it was so worth it to finish this book. I have not loved a book this much in a really long time. And I love the fact that I'm still discovering books that I love so much. This one absolutely blew me away. Jordan Ifueko created an amazing world, an amazing cast of characters. And even though this book starts when Tarasai, the main character, is very little and goes up until she's about 15 or 16, so almost a full decade, Ifueko does it in 300 some pages. And at points, it doesn't feel slow, but it also doesn't feel rushed. It doesn't feel like she's constantly throwing action at you and you have no time to recover. Every step of the way. It fits, it works, it kept me reading. The first night that I read it, I didn't want to put the book down, but I knew I couldn't read 150, 200 pages in a night and still be coherent for work in the morning. So I did put it down that first night, but that second night, I could not put it down. I absolutely love this book. The way that Ifueko builds the cultures of this empire and how she creates a fantasy world that deals with problems that we can see in the world today without coming out as straight allegory is just absolutely magnificent. And the sequel to the duology has come out. I'm always really nervous with sequels. I'll probably do another video on why I don't actually read very many sequels and I read a lot of first books in the series. But for this one, I actually just watched a booktuber's review of the sequel and how much they really liked it. So I love this one so much that I want the second one to be just as good. Next, I have The Heart That Bleeds, Latin America Now. Technically, this book was published 25 years ago, so the now part of it is not as much now, but it is a poignant picture on the struggles in various areas of Latin America. The author, Alma Guillermoprieto, is a journalist, or was a journalist. I don't know if she currently writes. And this book compiles various long-length stories that she's done on different issues and things that come up in Latin America. She arranges them in chronological order, not necessarily the order that she wrote them, and not in geographical order. So she'll start in, I don't remember where she starts, but she could start in Lima and then go to Mexico City and then go to Medellin and then Buenos Aires. And these chapters are just a fascinating look on current events of Latin America at a time when I really didn't pay attention. Of course, I wasn't even 10 yet when most of these things happened, but I don't think a lot of the world's attention was on this either, because it was just after the end of the Cold War. And so a lot of the focus, it sort of was trying to find its footing in that time. And I will say this took me longer to read than I expected, but not because of the book itself. I have discovered that when I read at the end of a workday and it's nonfiction, I tend to fall asleep. This is now the third or fourth nonfiction book that I've tried to read in that way, and it keeps happening. Apparently something with fiction, I can stay awake, but so this one took me a little bit longer, but I did finish it and I did really enjoy it. Next we have The Grimm Legacy. And I thought, okay, this might be a good book. This might be a good middle grades book. No. About halfway through, when I picked it up, I happened to see the back, and I saw that one of the author's other books was blurbed by Stephanie Meyer, and I went, yeah, that kind of confirms what I already see about this book. Polly Shulman took a fantastic idea and ruined it. I think my biggest problem with this was I never really connected with any of the characters. I never really understood any of the characters. They kept acting different ways. You never knew which one you were supposed to trust. The quote-unquote love interest was absolutely unlikable. He was nosy, tattletale, like, no fun. How is he supposed to be the love interest? Also, I could not figure out what age Elizabeth, the main character, was supposed to be. My guess is that she's supposed to be in high school. I couldn't even figure out based on the classes she was taking. The lack of actual character development or even creation. No, not ever reading anything by this author again. The last book that I'll talk about this month is The Map That Changed the World. Now technically, because I'm recording this 3 days before the month ends, I haven't quite finished this yet. However, I know that I will finish this before the end of the month, and I may get to one of the other two books that I talked about in my TBR, but I know that I will finish this one. And I have enjoyed every Simon Winchester book that I have read, and this one is no different. It's talking about basically geology, and it's fascinating. I'm reading it at night before I go to bed on school days, and I'm staying awake. Like, it's so good. I know that I will end up, when I finish it, I'm about halfway. I know that I'll enjoy it, and I'll probably rate it 4 stars, maybe even 5. That wraps up September's reading, and I got to almost all of the books on the TBR. Now, if I had finished Russia during August, I probably would have had enough time to get to the other books, the other 2 books. But I consider that a successful month, especially during the school year when I used to not get to as many books. And coming up in the next video, you'll see my October TBR. It is going to be a few days into October, so hopefully I will have gotten to some of the books. Thanks so much for joining me on this wrap up
hopefully you found some amazing books because I've read some really good books this month, and I hope to see you in the next video.